Grace, Ben is entering the room. All right, so thank you guys all for coming to our last history department event of the semester. It's most fitting that we hear from the students last because they get the last word here. And I just want to thank you for coming. Thank you for coming at this busy time. Thank you for coming at this crazy time. And, you know, we're recording this session so that we have it forever. We can look back at this as part of our COVID-19 archive and as part of our history department archive. So that's pretty cool. All right, and we're going to start with Grace Paré.
Okay, let me share my screen. All right, can you all see this? Okay, so let me move the people box again. Oh dear. It's always covering like half of my presentation. Okay, so the question I was looking at for my thesis was sparked when I read the Hagiography of Saint Edmund, who was an East Anglian king. He was the last East Anglian king before the Viking invasions. And what I noticed when I read this hagiography is like the story of a saint's life before and after death. I noticed that the characterization of the living saint was like far different from the characterization of the relics. So while Saint Edmund was alive, he was extremely like self-sacrificial, extremely humble, characterized as like just willing to serve his people all the way. And then after he died, his relics performed miracles that demanded veneration. So they would perform like harmful miracles like killing people or freezing people or striking people with sicknesses to ensure that they were venerated properly. And I was kind of confused by this question, like why exactly is the saint so transformed by death? Okay, it's not letting me use the arrow keys now. Here we go. All right, so the question I asked was, why are the living saints in hagiography characterized so differently from their dead counterparts? And the short answer, just to lay it all on the table for you, is I think the living saints and the dead saints serve entirely different purposes in the hagiography. The living saints are meant for like a role model for Christians to imitate, whereas the dead saints are meant for Christians to obey. And this is also complicated by the fact that the dead saint, you know, can't really speak for themselves. So whoever writes the hagiography can kind of use them as a tool to show, you know, what the divine will is or where the authority lies with them. So I started by looking at, well, I didn't start. I looked at 3 periods of saints. The first was Carolingian saints. And what's really crazy about the Carolingian era is that the production of hagiographies from the Merovingian dynasty, which was right before the Carolingians, to the Carolingian dynasty, the production of hagiographies went up by like 200%. So it went from like, I can't see it, but it's like 40 something to 155 within just the switch from one dynasty to the other. I put a quote from my thesis in here. I thought like, it made me feel really important to put quotes from my own thesis in a PowerPoint, so I did. And I talked a little bit about how the relics of saints were integral to devotional practice and political order. So they both affected how people practiced Christianity and also how people were ruled by the, you know, Christian empires. Charlemagne really liked to style himself as like the defender of Christendom. And he actually, as you can see on the right here, this elephant picture, he had Einhard, who was a scholar in his court, write this whole story about how he went to Jerusalem. He met with like the, you know, the leader of the Byzantine Empire, and the guy gave him like all these relics from the Passion of Christ and also an elephant. None of this ever happened. He never, you know, went east past Italy ever in his life. But this is just a way of connecting his empire and his dynasty to this like moment of contact where, you know, heaven meets earth in Jerusalem, basically, right? The Holy Land is the place where the divine touches down. And in order to gain access to that sort of communication, that conduit power, his dynasty, he and his son Louis the Pious especially, put a lot of emphasis on the relics of saints, especially because a lot of the relics of saints were not from the Holy Land or the Eastern Empire. They could show that the Western Empire had an equal amount of contact and legitimacy from divine power. On the left, you see him being crowned by the Pope. You know, he was completely tying his power to the church's power. through this. He also legislated that all new altars built in churches had to contain a relic of a saint. So this like drove up the market for relics, and people would like steal them and like buy them. People would make fake ones to sell because they were so necessary. And also people had to take all their oaths on relics. Like we swear in the Bible, they did it on relics. So here, I'm going to tell you the story of Saint Willibrord. Well, I'm not going to tell you the whole story. I'm going to tell you about how they characterize the living Saint Willibrord compared to the dead Saint Willibrord. So he was a Northumbrian saint. He wasn't necessarily Carolingian, but his life was pretty close, like time-wise, to the Carolingian Empire. And so the Carolingian writer, Alcuin, who worked for Charlemagne and Louis the Pious, and so it's, be careful what he was writing, characterized him as a very like submissive and like, non-political figure, even though a large part of his life was determined by conflict between the church and the state. So he went to Ireland in 678. He followed his abbot, Sir Saint Wilfrid. And the story that Alcuin writes is just like, oh, he wanted to see the Irish schools. He heard that they were great and they were good and he wanted to see them. And it's very weird. Like when he doesn't ever really explain why. He's just like, he went to Ireland. What really happened was that the abbot, St. Wilfrid, had actually convinced King Egfrith, who was the king of Northumbria, his wife Ethelthryth, to join a religious house. And so there was this conflict between the church and state where the king was like, you're interfering, first of all, with my household, second of all, with my line of succession by stealing my wife away from me. So he expelled him from York, and that's why he actually had to leave. But Alcuin conveniently left this out because it, sets a precedent that religious people can disagree and actually, prevail against secular powers. He actually succeeded in getting the queen to join a religious house. So St. Willibrord dead is a completely different story, right? Because a Christian can choose to imitate a living saint, but not a dead saint, right? That's kind of supposed to be like, this is your reward once you've lived this good life. So while you're living, make sure you're doing what the living saint was doing. And Willibrord's relics, as you can see on the right, this is like a tiny little chip of bone they now have, like they still have a piece of him. But his relics are really powerful in the story, and most of the miracles they perform are healing, but only for people who are very respectful, who like approach his relics with like, fear and trembling and like plead with him to be healed. The way that he deals with people who don't respect his relics is very harsh. So there's this deacon who comes and like steals the little golden cross that he used to carry with him on his missionizing trips, and he immediately gets sick and dies. And Alcuin takes this opportunity to like kind of sermonize a little bit in the Hagiography. This quote in the bottom says, "You see, brethren, what a fearful judgment was visited upon the man who presumed to desecrate the church of God's saint by stealing." So this is really different, right, than the living saint who, they conveniently left out like that whole conflict. Like he doesn't have any conflict with anyone. Like he goes around performing, very healing and prosperous miracles, giving people food and whatever. And then when he's dead, it's like, oh, if you disrespect him, that's it, you're done, right? He falls sick and immediately dies. There's no chance for repentance here. So what I was noticing here was that if the Carolingians were using these relics, they obviously wanted the relics to be seen as like a force, right? Like they wanted them to be an instrument of power. And therefore in their hagiographies, they would have to like show the miracles, like show what they're capable of. I have relics and relics can kill, whereas when they're alive, they're just talking about, how you should act as a Christian in their realm. Don't fight with the emperor. It's not, no saint ever did. So, oh yeah, this is just my analysis. The writer of the Hagiography could use the miraculous power of the relics to strike fear in people's hearts, ensuring good Christian behavior, but also not only by providing the ideal image of the living saint's life, but also by holding that danger of divine judgment above the audience's head. Yeah, there's also this little note I made here of relic thefts. We'll get back to that later on. So I moved on then to monastic hagiography, which was really on the rise in like the 9th and 10th centuries when there was this period of reform following the Viking invasions. I like this map because I didn't know personally that the Vikings got so far into, Europe. The green areas are the parts where they were just, raiding. They didn't really settle there, but they were raiding. And you can see that it goes pretty deep into the Carolingian Empire, which is I can't really, oh, I'll just circle it. It's like around here. So that led to, well, it contributed to the demise of the Carolingian Empire. And there was kind of a period of chaos. Sorry, that's my dog. Let me go close my door. There was a period of chaos, uncertainty, and during this time, a lot of Saxon monks would collect lists of saints and just where they were buried as a way to just, keep it all organized while all this craziness was going on. But they never really wrote a lot of hagiography in the sense that they didn't add like afterlife miracles. It was all just the vita of the saint, the life of the saint. But however, in the 10th century, well, the 10th and 11th century, a lot of Norman monks were brought into England by William the Conqueror, and a lot of them would go and find these stories of saints, revise them, and like go around like kind of researching, like interviewing people, what they know about like the saints' relics, and then add on all the afterlife miracles, which is really cool. Oh, my arrows are working now, great. So there's a new type of saint because of the Viking invasions, and it's the patriotic saint, who's a martyr and is also really emotional, strangely enough. I have an explanation for that, but I'm not going to get too far into it because it's going to be very sidetracked. So there were all these people who had died during the Viking invasions, and a lot of important people had died because, kings went to war, kings interacted in a military basis. And so there was an opportunity again for martyrs to exist. Remember, like the Roman Empire had outlawed Christianity. And so like during that era, there were martyrs, but then there was this long stretch of time when no one was dying for being Christian. But then again, because now they're fighting with like pagan Danes, they have a chance again to be martyrs. So that reintroduces this new type of saint. So my favorite hagiography, Saint Edmund. I was gonna say Saint Dog. Okay. Anyway, so he is, like I said in the beginning, this 9th century last king of East Anglia. The Danes invade his kingdom and they deliver this ultimatum: either Edmund must share the wealth and treasure of his nation with them, or they will kill him. And he's like, okay, the latter. What I found really interesting was this anxiety that was kind of like written into this story about losing the culture and wealth of the nation. So he's asked to deliver over the wealth, and what that means, like what they're referring to is like, like the equivalent of like the crown jewels, the things that are held, like the things that are gold plated in his castle and his church. And these are all like things that are very central to East Anglian, identity. And this was threatened by Viking invasion. So he dies, not necessarily, like he kind of starts saying that he's like dying for his people, but that's not at all what he's doing. He's dying for the culture of his people, to preserve their, national wealth. So the way he dies is he's shot full of arrows, and he just won't die, so they behead him. And they don't want people to like worship his remains, the Vikings anyway, so they take his head and they throw it into the woods, and they take his body and throw it in a different direction. And the people go looking for it, and they're like, okay, this is impossible, we're never going to find this. And they hear this like little voice shouting, here, here, here. They follow the voice, and there's just the head of the king between the paws of a wolf shouting, here. So, he's always now portrayed, this is actually at Bury St. Edmund, which is, in England, and it's supposed to be the site where he was buried, but this is like the wolf, that was guarding him. So his like symbols are the wolf and the crown. So after death, he changes greatly. He is no longer the person willing to die for his people and let people shoot him full of arrows. So years later, they're looking for him, and they find his body incorrupt, which is a sign of sainthood and also a sign of virginity. So he died a virgin, and so he became a saint, and his body was incorruptible. So people, give him like gold-plated stuff, and they bury him, and this attracts grave robbers. And when the grave robbers go to rob his grave, they're frozen. And then the next morning they find them and they hang them. And in a similar miracle, a man like wants to see what he looks like. He's like, I don't know if he's really incorruptible. Let me see that body. And so he like goes and opens his grave. The guy just goes mad. Is disowned by his father because his father is so disgusted by his crimes. And then he dies. This thing on the right, it's really funny. This year in January, they started an excavation in the tennis courts of Bury St. Edmunds because they think that's where they've left the remains. And I thought that was very funny because, according to the hagiography, it's a terrible idea to dig up Saint Edmund, so they should be careful. So, like, why? Why does this happen? First of all, I think one of the main reasons is this thing about relic thefts. So a lot of monastic houses would, go on little missions that they would say were like, inspired by visions from God or from the saint themselves, saying like, come get me, I don't want to be buried here. And so the monastery at Bury St. Edmund's, by propagating these kinds of miracles, like, oh, if you dig him up, he will kill you, would dissuade people from attempting relic thefts. Then there's a few other reasons that also contribute to this change. As he's alive, he's like the Christ symbol in the context of Viking invasion. So he's the sacrificial lamb, the kind of, giving your life up for your country sort of thing. Then once he's dead, he becomes like a weapon against the ungodly, right? So he becomes like this object that, will strike down the ungodly, which are kind of in, Anglo-Saxon minds at this point, still connected with Viking, pagan, ungodly, Viking. That's something that it's like still married in their mind, because this is very shortly after. So when he's alive, he is representing good Christian actions. Like, what can you do for Christ? What can you do for Christendom? You can sacrifice your life is what you can do, which again is like totally tied to the idea that there have been all these invasions and people have been dying. So this is like the Christian thing to do, is to die at the hands of Vikings. As a dead saint, he's a symbol of power that backs Christian action. Like, why exactly should you die? Well, this is like the powerful God that, we're worshiping. In addition, his martyrdom, I forgot to include this in the slides, but what's really important is that his martyrdom is completely connected with the death of Christ, right? So he switches from being a person to being elevated by this process of martyrdom. So he's no longer really a person, but sort of like a hybrid God-man who has both like the authority of Christ, but also like has connections with the earth, so people can like communicate through him. So my last section, which I am still working on, so I didn't go super in depth with it. I wanted to talk about the consolidation of power in late medieval hagiography. This period, from the 11th century on, I mean, the 11th century is still the middle, but like from the 12th, 13th century on, is a little different from the earlier centuries, because the church, like the central church, becomes so much more powerful. They begin regulating everything, they begin like making rules for who can become a saint and who can't, like how should you investigate whether the rumors of miracles are true or not. And so there's a lot of posthumous miracles that just do not get written into hagiography after that. I don't have the book with me, I left it downstairs, but the Golden Legend, written by Jacobus de Voragine, who was a Dominican friar, the hagiographies are really short. So it's like a book like this thick, but it's got like 300 hagiographies in it. And they're basically just to mention like, this is the saint you worship on this day. It's almost like a calendar. So everything becomes very prescribed, very organized. And it's a little bit sad to me because they're no longer so interesting to read, but it's really indicative of the way that the monarchy was, the papal monarchy, the Pope, seeing himself as a secular ruler as well, was seeking to enforce these restrictions so that people didn't have their, like cult of their saint in their town that could do anything. They had to rely more on church authority. Okay, so let me tell you why this is important, because I don't want to just write about medieval stuff and then, leave it in the past. I think it's really important to study hagiography because the way that lay Christians, people who were not monks, priests, bishops, whatever, in the Middle Ages practiced Christianity was entirely dependent upon the cults of saints. What I found really interesting was that when I was reading the story of Joan of Arc, she says she saw visions from, Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch. These two saints were like saints that were specifically for young women. And I think it's really important to see that Christians would use saints as a way to relate the religion of Christianity to their particular identity. These two were symbols of militant virginity. So she, so had a vision also from Saint Michael, but these two were like ideals of what she could be as a Christian. I think also in a more general sense, studying hagiography is important because this shift from like the living saint that like shows you what you can do when you're alive, and the dead saint who shows you like what people can become in people's imagination afterward, is really important for examining our own process of like creating heroes out of people who have died. I think we have a tendency to idealize the past and past figures. And also you see a lot of times that people will weaponize a figure saying like, oh, if this person were alive, they would have said this. Like, for instance, around Martin Luther King Jr. Day, people were saying things like, Martin Luther King Jr. would never have supported Black Lives Matter because he was so peaceful. Meanwhile, first of all, these people haven't read a lot from the figure they're talking about, and they've idealized him as this symbol of peace and like, you know, like relaxing and like taking like having good relationships with authority. So they've created something that he was not in their mind. And I think it's really important that we see this tendency in humans as something that has existed for hundreds of years. I mean, I just went from like the 7th century to the 13th century, and we still have this tendency. So I think that's one of the reasons I find this important. So that is it. Thank you. That's St. Valentine. I just really like that picture because it's so funny that they dressed up a skeleton, but that's it. Right,
awesome. Thanks, Grace. Can you stop sharing your screen so we can see everyone? And we'll take like 5 minutes to see if people have questions for you. Professor Meyer.
That was fabulous. I'm blown away. That was wonderful. Sorry, my earbuds keep falling out. This is the problem with putting on earbuds right after you get in the shower. What I was going to ask, I mean, first of all, I congratulate you. I mean, I think that I really don't know the historiography of this period as well as Professor Mancia, but I think that one thing that you showed is that obviously everyone understands that these hagiographies are really important sources, but I think you've shown that they're really being, you know, to use a fancy critical term, underread, that there's a lot more going on in there than the scholarship has really uncovered or appreciated. So I congratulate you for that. That's really great. That's, you know, really wonderful. And what I was going to ask is, have you looked in parallel? If you look at these hagiographies and you look at what's happening in the discussion of royal regalia, right? Because you mentioned it, right? In other words, what these saint artifacts are really becoming are regalia. You know, let me, you know, I'm going to put that word, I'm sorry, and I realize I'm eating up a lot of time, but that, you know, what are regalia? Regalia are unique items that are, you know, can't be counterfeited or are not reproducible, that show, if you have possession of them, it shows you must really be the king because nobody else could possibly have it. And so I think one thing you would see is that in this period, the importance of regalia are rising because this whole question of who's really a king is becoming more and more problematic in political terms. And then in terms of regalia themselves, there's a need to turn saints' relics into regalia because the Vikings are taking away everything else. Right? Anything that's made of silver or gemstones, the Vikings are going to run off with them. So what you're left with are bones. And, you know, the problem with bones, of course, is that they can be counterfeited. You could just dig up a bone and claim it's the relic of a saint. So I think part of what you're onto is just the function of these relics as regalia. In order for them not to be counterfeitable, it has to be true that if you steal them or try to counterfeit them, they kill you. And that the value of that is sort of in the story itself, right? Because you can hold up any bone and say, this has to be the bone of Saint Cuthbert. You know, if it wasn't, I would be struck dead right now. You know? But I don't know, I'm just throwing that out at you just for future thought, but I thought that was fabulous.
Thank you.
Was fabulous.
I think when I was writing about the Carolingians specifically, I wanted to get a little more deeply into their connection with the Merovingians, because they follow the Merovingians and they have to establish like why they should be the emperors instead of the Merovingians. So I should probably look more into that. But yeah, good stuff.
Anybody else with a question? All right, let's just give Grace a big round of applause. Fantastic job. All right, we're going to move forward about a bajillion years to Stephanie, to a different part of Europe. Go for it.
Can you guys see my screen?
No.
Oh,
yes.
All right. So I'll be talking about Russia during the 1930s. I took Professor O'Keefe's class on Stalinism, her colloquium on Stalinism. So one of my favorite books that we read in her class was Sheila Fitzpatrick, Everyday Stalinism. So let me just try to move this. So who is Sheila Fitzpatrick? Sheila Fitzpatrick is an Australian-American historian who focuses a lot of her research on the social and cultural history of Russia during the regime of Lenin and Stalin. In 1986, she was a leader of the second generation of revisionist historians who demanded that the voices of those from below should be heard and should be like put out there along with the politics of Russia. So I'm just going to talk about a few of her chapters in her book. So in chapter 2, Hard Times, she discusses the shortages of food and housing and other basic necessities. In the 1930s, people lived in tight spaces with multiple people and in these areas oftentimes became very unhygienic just because, like Russia wanted to be like this huge empire and take control of like every little country. So they were like trying to get people to come into Russia and just assimilate to them and their practices of the construction of socialism and communism. And so because of this, it caused a lot of places to be like crammed up and a lot of shortages, a lot of famine going on during this time. And Sheila Fitzpatrick said things mattered enormously in the Soviet Union in the 1930s for the simple reason that they were hard to get. So with the arrival of new people into the state, food supply came short, leading to birth rate to diminish, the mortality rate to increase. And in order to survive, what citizens began doing is creating their own second economy. They relied on their own system, which they called blat, which were friendships based on favors they can do or what they can trade in exchange for a necessity that they need. And I'll get more into that later. So since Soviet workers began to rely on their second economy, there were certain since Soviet workers began to rely on their second economy, there was certainty that this would only be temporarily. They believed that a better lifestyle was soon to come. When Stalin came into power, propaganda about the coming of the new world of socialism in Russia began to spread, and the beginning of making plans on modernizing Russia with building spacious stations, escalators, and even a plan to create a place of the Palace of the Soviets with a statue of Lenin to commemorate him. Fitzpatrick uses memoirs such as those that grew up during this time. One of which was, I'm going to pronounce his name really bad, Raza Orlova, who had high hopes of leaving her torn down apartment, her horrible lifestyle, and be part of like this new age of like the rise of the Russian Empire. And during this time, a lot of people were like so attracted to this idea that, hey, we're gonna like build up Russia. We're gonna have all these nice amenities. We're going to have equal opportunities for men, women of different nationalities and whatnot. And so the age of heroism started to happen during this time, just to like attract more people and put it out there. So some of these heroes were explorers, aviators, and also Stahanovites, which were ordinary celebrities, as they put it, that were basically workers, factory workers, saleswomen, teachers, and etc., who were recognized for their contribution to be recognized as heroes. And in order for like them to be part of this, like to be a Stahanovite, they needed to have integrity, honesty, loyalty, and self-sacrifice for Stalin and the country, right? So one of the heroes that Sheila Fitzpatrick mentioned is of a 14-year-old boy, Pavlik Morozov, who reported his father for hoarding grains. So, you know, like back then, like farmers were seen as like the most peasants of the peasants, the worst people that you could ever be, because they're the ones farming, they're the one that had the majority of agriculture and the ones that basically controlled it and whatnot. So because he reported his father hoarding these grains, his family killed him. And yeah, it was pretty bad. And he was soon after his death, the state recognized him as a hero to the state. So dark stuff there. So in regards to culture, what it meant to have culture during that time was to have good hygiene, a well-kept home, separate beds, toothbrushes, and towels for the family, and you needed to speak Bolshevik. Speaking Bolshevik meant that people began to police one another, making sure they behaved, talked in a civil manner, and making sure that they were doing their job the correct way, making sure their working area was kept up and all of that. People began to even change their names into well-known socialist figures. So what they would do is try to combine Stalin's name and Lenin's name, a bunch of other names, which is really interesting. All right, so another chapter in her book was the Magic Tablecloth. So I chose this picture just because it was funny, but it was dark humor, I guess you would call it. But during the time of like the construction of socialism and communism, when famine and poverty hit the state really hard, people still had hope, right? They show how ordinary factory workers were recognized, and also in literature. So in literature, a magic tablecloth, it would usually be red, was used to promote the abundance of food and we're promising that soon everyone will have food on their table. Not only will there be food on the table, but also activities that the community can take part in, such as carnivals, fairs, parties, you know, and newspapers also started to describe that stores will soon have an abundance of supplies that anyone and everyone can buy. Because yeah, there were supermarkets, but they were out of stock of a lot of things during the time. And it was only accessible to some people. It wasn't available to everyone, just like the elites. And during this time, the definition of what it meant to be cultured also started to change. To be cultured now meant going to car races, going to the theater, watching plays, going to concerts, sending your children to summer camps, and much more. So you see how like they were trying to move away from like this capitalist lifestyle, the bougie lifestyle, and they're kind of integrating it back again into society. So while everything was going on what he promised, in reality, during like Stalin's 5-year plan, famine struck hard. Fitzpatrick mentions that privilege in Stalin's Russia had more to do with access, the ability to obtain goods, services, and apartments. So like I mentioned before, the second economy. So only those who were recognized by communist leaders are the ones receiving these benefits. And a couple days ago, Professor Queep had us read an article, Scott's article on how Georgian food came into the Soviet Union because Stalin was Georgian. And in the article, it talks about how prominent like leaders would go to these very like gatherings full of food and drinks and all that. So what I found interesting in it, that in the article, was that Stalin created his own dish, the Aragavi dish, which was eggplants, tomatoes, potatoes, black pepper, bay leaf, and pieces of lamb. So I found that really interesting, how he's having all these feasts. He's like telling everyone, don't worry, like you guys are all soon gonna get this. But then again, it's like, you have a lot there, you could just share it with us. But, you know, and he knew of this like second economy. He knew what people were doing and he was okay with it. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't like prosecute people because they were practicing the second economy, because he's like, good, like let them do that. Let them think that there's new things to come, soon to come. But in reality, it never really came during Stalin's time. So as I previously mentioned, the patron and client, the black system that they use. So the clients were the ordinary people who had hard times in obtaining goods and favors and seek the assistance of patrons. Patrons tended to be higher officials who helped their clients obtain what they needed, and patrons often felt like the protectors of the cultured people who were willing to do anything to further progress the building of socialism and communism. And yeah, that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. I love that these were two different types of presentations. Like we got a little taste of this book you read for Professor O'Keefe. So cool. Who has questions for Stephanie? Professor Napoli says that he just ordered this book. You did a good job selling it, Stephanie.
It's one of my favorite books. So, from like the other books that all my professors have gave me, along with Professor Karp's, I see you there. Kathleen Duvall's book, I've read that again.
Celine asks, why is it your favorite?
So I guess it's the way Professor O'Keefe presented us with the subject of like Russia and Stalin, you know, and yeah, like getting the firsthand look at the ordinary people instead of like hearing about these big other leaders like Stalin and Lenin. Like, yeah, kind of know about them, but like, what about like people? Like, how did they actually feel about this? You know, how, but there's also like problems with that, because it's like, did they really enjoy this lifestyle? Did they really have high hopes? Or like, what are they fabricating something? Are they hiding something, you know?
Yeah. I think that's something that ties all of your presentations together, is this interest in ordinary people. And you each are going to get at it in different ways, using different types of sources and in different types of time periods. But that's pretty cool, actually. We didn't even plan that. Look at that. All right. And Stephanie, another round of applause for Stephanie. And we're going to move on to Melka.
Okay. I'll share my screen. Can everyone see it? Wonderful. So I'm going to talk about Vietnam and the Vietnam War and the use of chemical weapons, specifically within the Vietnam War, though I'm also going to place it within its context of other chemical weapons. And I came to this is generally not a subject that I would be like totally interested in, but I was doing an independent study with Professor Napoli. And he has been doing extensive work in the after effects of Agent Orange use in Vietnam. And so that kind of became my subject also. And I'm kind of, I think the pandemic at present really puts a highlight on this issue also, for reasons that I'll speak about soon. But to place this use of chemical weapons in context, I'd like to go back a little bit to the really real first wide-scale use of chemical warfare in the 20th century with World War I, and the use of mustard gas and phosgene and chlorine gas. And this extensive use and the resulting physical and emotional and mental trauma that resulted were the catalyst for the Geneva Protocol in 1925. And, you know, the interesting thing about this, about the Geneva Protocol, was that it was through the League of Nations. And the United States did not join the League of Nations. So when the League of Nations eventually became, or was the predecessor to the UN adopted this protocol, and the United States did not ratify the Geneva Protocol until 1965. So everything that kind of happens before then, there is a general excuse used that, you know, the United States had not ratified the Geneva Protocol, so we're not subject to necessarily the same consequences as other countries who had signed or ratified the protocol. In the 1930s, there's a continued research and use into different chemical weapons, and the development of nerve gas became like a really big thing. Because of the debate on what defines a chemical weapon, there are different scholars who say that the use of different gases and chemicals in the concentration camps during World War II, and the use of the atomic bomb, whether those count as chemical weapons, is up for debate. But if you were to place that in like the larger, these had chemical after effects, you could place it there. And throughout the 50s, there were continued development of chemical weapons, but and they were generally in smaller scale conflicts and civil wars that were taking place around the world. But during Vietnam, the use of specifically herbicides, which had been researched during the Second World War, really came to the forefront. And Agent Orange was kind of the culmination of all of these different previous agents, which were blue, purple, white, and it was called Agent Orange because of its distinct orange color. And the herbicide was essentially used, the original intended purpose was to deforest and defoliate much of Vietnam in an effort to find the North Vietnamese soldiers. And it was used from 1961 to 1972 for a period of around 11 years. And there are various numbers that are placed on the amount that was sprayed, but a general figure is like 20 million gallons. And that's the amount that was sprayed. However, there are also particular hotspots that either are attributed to overspraying or dumps that happened where the Agent Orange was stored within military bases or Air Force bases. So when Kennedy inherited like the deteriorating Vietnam problem, he consented to the use of Agent Orange, and originally they began testing it using South Vietnamese planes they were American planes that were disguised as South Vietnamese planes that had Americans in them who were spraying the herbicide, and this use eventually became known as Operation Ranch Hand. And the basic intrinsic problem with Agent Orange is that it contains dioxin. And dioxin is an extremely toxic substance. It is one of the most toxic substances. And so ultimately, no matter if they were just using it for deforestation, which is problematic in and of itself, the people who are spraying the toxin and the people who are getting sprayed on are going to be seriously and severely affected by what they were inhaling and getting on their skin. And so this problem, this like deeply damaging substance, continues to have an effect on people today and also the land today, including such things as birth defects, various diseases, and many diseases can be attributed to Agent Orange. But the problem with it is that there has not been a wide enough study, nor has there been money enough to provide a deep enough study to show that many of the diseases attributed are not just presumptive diseases, but they are actually totally connected. So, for example, if a veteran wants to claim benefits for what they believe to be an Agent Orange related disease, they have to provide a bunch of different kinds of evidence to the VA, and then their claim is generally on a case-by-case basis, unless it's of a very specific list, some of which include non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, or in children, spina bifida, and prostate cancer and diabetes. But a lot of this, again, is on a case-by-case basis, so if they don't provide enough evidence, their claim can be denied, and then they have to, excuse me, then they have to try and claim again and again, and many people don't claim they're not able to get their claim established until even after they're dead, and their children have to, or their wives have to continue to claim. So it's an extremely messy situation in that regard. And in the case of the Vietnamese, little to nothing has been totally done. There are different areas in which children who have birth defects that are, again, presumptive based on Agent Orange, that many places where those children and those people can go to like live and be cared for, because many of them have a lot of physical disabilities. And I tried to choose a picture that was of less of a disturbing image, but there is one photographer, Philip Jones Griffith, who composed a book of photographs of these children and of these teenagers and adults who have lots of disabilities based on Agent Orange exposure. And so, of course, people pushed back at what they were seeing as their own government poisoning them. And in 1979, a bunch of veterans got together and they put forth a case against many of the chemical companies who had produced the chemical Agent Orange for the United States government. And their claim was eventually settled out of court by a judge named Weinstein, I believe. And this same judge presided over the later case in 2003 of the Vietnamese nationals bringing their own case against these same chemical companies. And their case was completely was thrown out. And it was seen as there was not enough evidence. And as the United States had not adopted the Geneva Protocol of 1925, they did not have the human rights violations against them were not as strong. And so this case was dismissed in 2005, and the kind of central issue in this whole situation is this lack of proof of causation, that there are only these presumptive diseases. There is no established, like, this is what happened. And on average, the dioxin test to test if a person has dioxin in their blood is $1,000, which is, for many, many people, too much money. And especially people in Vietnam who are of a poorer class. So the issues surrounding this include within them, like poverty, disease, oppression, and all of those things. So then begs the question, what is the role of the government in all of this, aside from the fact that they are the perpetrators? Well, after the Vietnam conflict, there was a silent period where not very much happened, and during the Reagan administration, a lot of the Vietnamese kind of accusations were pushed off. But in the 90s, when normalization began, the Vietnamese put the Agent Orange issue, they pushed it a little back because they wanted to concentrate on creating trade deals between Vietnam and the United States, and they didn't want to be seen as aggressive or accusatory, and because that might break trade deals. So eventually there was a joint agreement between the Vietnamese and the Bush administration that there would be, talks were began with the Clinton administration and then the George Bush administration, that there would be a study done into the connection between dioxin, Agent Orange, and many of the disease birth defects that these veterans and their children were seeing. But eventually, the money for that petered out because the Bush administration stated that the Vietnamese did not agree to the way that they were going to go about this study. And so it kind of ended in a like petering out of interest. However, like the issue is still very prevalent. And there are similar patterns with this deniability and lack of willingness to pay for benefits for veterans that can be seen within the Gulf War and Gulf War syndrome, and also the burn pits, which were like pits of toxic material from paint, munitions, human waste that were burned in Iraq and Afghanistan. And both of these have chemical effects in the veterans that have come back from those conflicts. So much of this is veterans having to continuously fight and present lawsuits and claims when really, if their government got them into this, they should be taking responsibility and taking care of these people. So my ultimate conclusion, and I think this is extremely prevalent now given that many Vietnam veterans die very young in their like 50s and 40s, 50s and 60s, and with the pandemic happening right now, so many of these people are dying, and such an issue should not be lost. We should not let go something that is so intrinsic, especially as it's an ongoing situation, given current chemical warfare and even if we may get into further conflict. And in my opinion, I think that the people of these various groups who have been affected by different chemical conflicts, if they were able to create a coalition of perhaps victims of chemical warfare, and they were able to gather that force in an efficient way, making their voices heard would be much easier because it's a wider generation. It's veterans of many conflicts, and they're all raising their voices to say, look, you did this to us, now it's time for you to help us. And that power in all of those voices, in an age where we're seeing so much activism, would, in my opinion, really, really strengthen the compensation for the issue. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Malka. All right. Questions for Malka?
Can I ask one?
I had, who did I just cut off? Sorry.
That was, sorry, Steve, please go right ahead. It's all good.
No, well, Malka, when sorry. Of course. When I saw you were presenting, my guess was, well, for sure she's going to talk about Dwight Eisenhower, because Malka wrote a very fine research paper for me about Dwight Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur in History 2001. But at least you got, you mentioned him at least once. I heard his name, right?
I mentioned that Kennedy inherited the Vietnam situation.
Yeah, okay, well, all right. About 10 years ago, I spent a couple of weeks traveling around Vietnam, and when I went to Ho Chi Minh City, I went to the War Museum. And one of the things that struck me was how much attention was paid to the environmental damage of the war on Vietnam. And so if this was something you were going to pursue or just for your own interest, when you mentioned the burn pits, it made me think of this. The environmental impact on the land, in addition to human bodies, I mean, some of those slides you showed, of course, the exfoliant, the Agent Orange being dumped. It seems to me to be this whole additional part of this picture, and not just Agent Orange. I mean, 25% of Vietnam's land to this day is uninhabitable not because of Agent Orange, but because of unexploded ordnance, unexploded American bombs. 25%, so just your presentation really highlighted to me this kind of long-term and both physical human and environmental impact of this kind of warfare. It was really well done.
Thank you. I'd had a small section that I was going to mention, but yes, a lot of scholarship has gone into how the environmental impact of Agent Orange as well. But part of the efforts of the Vietnamese was to get money for the cleanup of many of those hotspots, and the United States did send private contractors to clean up some of those areas, but it became a case of we promised a lot of money and resources towards this, but didn't necessarily pay it up in either money or in any way. So.
Professor Napoli.
This is great. Thank you, Malka, very much. I'm looking forward to the final written result. I'm getting a sense of where we're going. It's cool. You made mention of the connection you saw to the pandemic, and I wanted to have you think out loud for us about the connections that you did see. I want to hear more.
Well, I think the main connection I would see is if a person has a pre-existing condition that could possibly be related to Agent Orange, I think that they would have issues with the current pandemic. And we see how it affects people with autoimmune disorders or people who have pre-conditions. I'm not 100% sure. But I would also say that you see a pattern of suppression from the people who are in power at the moment, and suppression of evidence and misinformation. And I think that definitely there has been a lot of misinformation and suppression of evidence around this issue as well. So those are like two main things that I could see, but I'm sure if I thought about it for a while more, I'd come up with many more things.
Professor Karp?
Yes. So my great-grandfather passed away young because of his World War I service due to mustard gas. And so it's interesting that you could think of these coalitions as being not just transnational, but potentially transhistorical. That was one thing I was thinking. But my questions are, one was whether you saw any presentist resonance in the difficulty of testing. And the other was, there's something kind of almost like meta-historical in kind of thinking about the issue as one of causation. And I just was wondering if that was something that you wanted to, right, the difficulty of discerning causation, right, and the way that that can be banalized and used by authorities, right, is fascinating to me. Banalized comes from Silencing the Past, which I was reading a week or two ago. Yeah, I'm just wondering if you had comments on either of those things. But all three of these, the papers that I saw today were fantastic.
When
presenters.
When I first started working with Professor Napoli on this paper, I thought for a very long time that I thought I was going to go in a legal direction with the paper, and a lot of that really involved proof of causation. And the idea that there would not be enough evidence to prove that many of these diseases and disorders are connected to Agent Orange was like totally fascinating to me in that like legal respect, because it really did prevent the veterans from getting like a full jury trial case, and it also like contributed to the throwing out of the Vietnamese case as well. So that technicality is so important, and I think the lack of willingness to put enough money into a full study to show that proof is not, I don't want to say twisted because that's a little too subjective of me, but it seems irresponsible that something like this could be caused by a government, and then in our age of awareness and information, be denied is very fascinating to me. So it's not the track that I ended up going, but it definitely formed the way that I did my research on like the documents and stuff that I read.
Any other questions from Malka? All right, just uproarious applause again for her.
Thank you.
All right, Celine, you're up.
Alrighty, give me 1 sec. Hi. So last semester, I conducted an oral history project with my friend Kinza. She can't join us right now. It was for Professor Napoli, and I will present this project as long as I live because I felt really proud of it. And I love it because I was always interested in like learning about women and culture and identity. So I basically, along with Kinza, we both just poured everything into this one project. So first, I just want to thank Professor Napoli for assigning me the project and teaching me the inner works of being a historian. And I want to thank all the participants for allowing me to interview them as immigrant women in New York City and sharing their experiences with me. And I appreciate all of them dearly. So in their multiple roles as students, professionals, wives, parents, caregivers, immigrant women play an important role in their community and society. So approximately 21 million female immigrants live in the United States, and they make up almost 13% of the nation's female population. And more than 3 million of New York City's 8.2 million residents were born outside of the United States. But shockingly enough, we couldn't find statistics on immigrant women in New York City. So Professor Ronnie Berger is our main source in support of the Project for Immigrant Women. She came here in the United States 30 years ago in 1989, and she's a current professor at Adelphi University for the School of Social Work. Her book, Telling the Stories of Immigrant Women, goes in depth about the experiences of immigration from the female perspective and the challenges it poses on to an individual. So according to Professor Ronnie Berger and Immigrant Women Tell Their Stories, it's an amazing book, I highly recommend it. She defines immigration as the motivation, which can be the push or pull factors to seek better economic, social, and political conditions. For example, improving children's opportunities for education, escaping war or prosecution, or personal experience like coming after a family member. So saying all of that, Kinza and I wanted to know, how does the intersectionality of gender and culture play an important role within the identities of these immigrant women? So more with Professor Ronnie Berger, she defines immigration, wait, one sec, I'm sorry. Professor Ronnie Berger also explains that immigrants face the need to choose between the options of mono and bicultural ethnic identity. The monocultural identity can be either the culture of origin or the absorbing culture. The bicultural identity incorporates both cultures in some type of combination. So during our interview, she stated that it's harder for immigrant women because there's always like this cultural expectation of their tradition, or quote unquote translators for the next generation. And for interviewees, their perception of who they are into their new country completely changed. And some aspects were especially like encountering racism, facing gender roles, cultural expectations, and simply the struggles within their own identity. So I'm just going to list out all of my participants and give some background on who they are. Arwa, 32, she came to New York City from Yemen when she was 10 years old in 1997. Her dad worked at Ford Motors in the States, and with enough finances, brought his family to New York City for better opportunities. She's a Brooklyn College student, undergrad, and she's currently studying childhood education. She's now married with 4 children. Tagreed, she's 27, and she came to New York City from Yemen when she was 18 years old in 2009. Her dad owned a grocery store, and with enough finances, brought his family to New York City for better opportunities, just like Arwa. And Tagreed is also a Brooklyn College undergrad that is currently studying childhood education. Ingrid, 70, she's actually my professor 2 semesters ago. She came to New York City from Guyana when she was 18 years old in 1967 to reunite with her mother. So her mother came here to work in the States first, and then she just followed her. And then Ingrid resided with her grandma while she was in Guyana until she came here, and she's an adjunct professor for science at Brooklyn College. Melissa, 22, she's my best friend. She came to New York City from Bosnia when she was 3 years old in 2001. her family decided to come together for a better life. They all came together at the same time. And she's currently an undergrad studying speech pathology at Brooklyn College. And she's actually the youngest of her three siblings and the youngest participant. And she's considered to be half generation in that sense. So within our study, we focused on three aspects. We focused on racism and discrimination. We focused on being a woman and cultural shock. So these were the most three aspects that we noticed that the women were talking about. So we just broke them up. So the first section, racism and discrimination, is that these women were somehow in their lives were facing some sort of discrimination based on their race and their religious preferences. So according to one of the studies by Espen in Race, Racism, and Sexuality in the Life Narratives of Immigrant Women, she states that women have several mountains on their back. The two most obvious ones being the heritage of tradition and the oppression from outside. So basically what she means is that women usually live split lives, either the dominant society or American society's open culture, which shapes their identity based on religious or racial differences. So Sigrid and Arwa being Yemeni and Ingrid being a Black woman, they've experienced a lot of prejudice and racism in their lives. So by these interviews, we have noticed that these women feel the pressures of racism imposed by the American society. So Arwa told me her experience of racism after the 9/11 attacks. And she talked about going to a private school for women only. And she would constantly say that after 9/11 happened, it just sparked like this immense amount of hate. She was the aim of hateful words. Eggs were thrown in the courtyard of her school. And she just really wanted to hide who she was. And, you know, during the interview, she was telling us, she's like, I'm not a terrorist, but that's what people equated me as solely because she's a hijabi woman. But, you know, she's like, it's like people were looking at her like, oh, you're wearing a do-rag and you're a terrorist. You shouldn't be in this country. And she had multiple instances of, you know, being told to go back. Ingrid, I was very affected. All of their stories were very, very upsetting to hear. But Ingrid's story is we're experiencing it right now. But Professor Ingrid's story, she talks about the color, facing racism based on the color of her skin. She said that whenever she goes into a store with her white counterpart, she noticed that you know, whoever is working would first look at the white counterpart's face, but with her, they would look at her hands first. She said that they would greet them, but not her. And she told us, she's like, I would walk with my hands behind my back as if I have handcuffs, or in front of me as if I'm praying. And she's like, this is just through careful observations throughout the years that she has made. And she claimed that she believes that racism used to be covert, now it's just overt, that it just happens all the time. To Greed, she didn't go in depth about her experiences so much, but she did notice that she encounters racism in different places. She stated that she sees racism in train stations. She didn't specify why in BC. Maybe she's seen it, but she didn't specify what. She's seen it in malls, hospitals. Yet Tigrid had a lighter, I guess, like explanation to why this was happening. She just said that she believes that people just tend to be racist because they're probably not educated, or they probably don't understand where people are coming from, especially her because she's hijabi, and she's noticed that people usually talk to her in a very different tone, I guess, just because she's hijabi. Again, she didn't go in depth about it, and I didn't want to force anything that she wasn't comfortable with. So Melissa didn't talk much about this part, but being a woman would be our next section. And the second account is being a woman, or the hegemonic expectations that these women had to comply because of their sex. So coming into a new country is a drastic change within one's life. It could be for anybody, you know, just moving somewhere new. They left behind a piece of themselves in their home country to resettle in a homeland where everything is unfamiliar to them. According to Berger and Immigrant Women Tell Their Stories, for women, international migration means to shift gender relations and stratification, moving from culture of origin, where roles are gender specific, to cultures of relocation that are more egalitarian. They face societal pressures to accommodate between the traditions of the family and the dominant culture of the resettlement. So for these women, they're expected to carry the roles of their culture and traditions. And Berger, within our interview, was telling us identity is just the core of you. It shapes everything you do. Maybe it's not conscious, but in every way. Especially for women, it's what you do, who you do it, when you do it. It's just, with women, it's a lot more, I guess, evident in that sense. Then she says that it's just a struggle. Immigrant women struggle in society because of their identity. And in her book, and like, I'm sorry, give me one sec, let me backtrack. So I'm kind of nervous at the same time. But so as these women that I've interviewed, they had expectations that they had to carry out because of their gender. And therefore, they believed that they had to adhere themselves into their traditional enclave. Yet, they still managed to sync with their new culture or American society. Berger uses terms to describing coping with identity, like clingers, eradicators, or vacillators. So clingers tend to adhere to the culture of origin. They tend to reject the dominant culture of the new place. So as in coming to America, they reject American traditions and ideals. Eradicators tend to erase their culture of origin, or in other terms, assimilate by relinquishing one's original cultural identity. So basically, coming here and just being American, they completely erase their past identity. And vacillators means that immigrants go back and forth between their culture of origin or observant culture that is mostly, vacillators is mostly based on the situation that they're in, so it depends. And in other contexts, integrators combine both cultures. Arwa's identity was first an eradicator, where she was embarrassed by her culture, but then she became an integrator and she learned to appreciate both. So she explains that when she came here, her mother refused to learn English. And her mother was very, very old school, meaning that, you know, Arwa had to learn how to cook and clean right away. And, you know, she had to stay at home, just deal with family and just follow the traditions. And also the other expectations of her was that, you know, she had to maintain a private life, wasn't allowed to socialize, pursue their dreams, or just marrying at 14, 15, 16 if they were really late. So 16 is considered to be a very late age to get married. So she's followed it through. She followed it to a certain point. But after all these years, you know, she struggled with her identity, and she would try to change or erase her identity, where she hated herself and who she was. But with time and age, she learned how to appreciate her culture. She knows that her culture is a part of her identity. Now she claims that there's like this, she's like in between being Yemeni and American, where she picks and chooses which aspect of both cultures would make her happy. Tagreed can be identified as a vacillator, where she keeps her Yemeni identity, but slowly integrated into the absorbing culture. So, you know, she's also the same culture as Arwa. So she would talk about how, like, you know, she was she was taught how to be a housewife, and that 6th grade was like enough for a woman to read and write. and they were just expected to be a housewife, take care of the home and the kids. And basically, they were prepared for marriage and their husbands. Yet later on, she said that she doesn't identify herself as an American Yemeni because she can't erase where she came from, but she also can't disregard how America has given her so many opportunities, such as education. Melissa is a vacillator. She tends to go back and forth between her identity, where she's Bosnian at home in American society. So basically, she talked about her roles as being a woman in her own home, which is like helping around the house, learning how to cook, clean. And she also talked about how like the differences between a male and female, because she has an older brother, how like, you know, having a curfew where her brother doesn't. But you know, that's how it is in their Bosnian culture, as in like the guys kind of free to do what they want as they please, but women are limited to certain decisions. She notices the unfairness there. But another responsibility now is that living in America, there's this expectation of getting an education. Her parents want her to be successful within the new land. And this is what Professor Berger was talking about, as in there's like this shift of expectations from the homeland within the new given environment, where it's to be successful within the new environment, but also keeping the original identity of the origin of culture. Ingrid Professor Ingrid is completely an eradicator. She said, I'm American more than Guyanese. Like, I still incorporated some aspects of Guyanese heritage, but when it came to raising her kids, she brought up her kids into American values and traditions, and that's it. That's all she was talking about. And then the third account was lifestyle changes. So the third account was basically like some sort of a cultural shock or the physical environment shock. Cultural shock can be caused by differences in language, weather, clothing, and society as a whole. Professor Berger mentions that the process of adjusting to the new culture is long and complex. The difference between both cultures evolves in a process of giving up and reshaping original values and patterns into the new American culture. So to Greed, I really loved her story. She was like, whoa, like my first impression of just, you know, landing at the airport. She was like, it was just a major cultural shock. She was like, it was an open society. You know, she was seeing women around more. The women were not cloth, they weren't covered. You know, everything was unisex. And, you know, she never knew that women could work at grocery stores. So that was like a big wow for her. And, you know, later on, as she started living here, she learned the importance of how women should work and be educated. Her expectations changed in that sense. So we see that shift in identity too, even if it's within like cultural shock, we see that shift of identity with Tigrid. She's saying that, you know, because all her life she was told differently that women can't get an education or work, but now her mentality completely changed. For her, as long as she has the title of being an educated woman, even if she doesn't get a job within that profession, she said that at least I have that title because that's what I wanted, and now she's able to get it. For Ingrid, her first impressions living in New York City is about spring. She actually wrote a whole book about that. I forgot what the name of the book is. She gave me a copy of it, but it's a children's book. And she wrote about her first experiences of spring. And she's like, every year it's just like, she's like, I'm in awe about spring, seeing like the flowers bloom. With Arwa, she talks about learning English, because as I mentioned before, her mother refused to learn English. So for Arwa, it was learning about English, like kind of going against her mother in that sense. She's like, I was just always like the teacher's pet, always so interested in like learning English. I would always watch English shows. You know, at every opportunity that she can get, she would try to learn English. So that was the end of the whole interview, but they all had a message to say to other immigrant women. But first, it is very important for immigrant women to share their stories as immigrants and as women about their lives in the United States. They have the same intentions of succeeding by working hard as all of us do. With all of these women sharing, it's like basically we're appreciating the diversity of New York City and, you know, meeting new people of different ethnicities, religions, backgrounds. And they were very kind enough to share their opinions and experiences with, you know, me and with us, and saying that they have some last words. So Ingrid, she said that everyone has a story to tell. And she's like, I learned from just by listening to those stories. It can be from the simplest to the complex, but it's always important to be open-minded and do more listening than more speaking. For Arwa, she was telling other immigrant women coming to America and making it their home was that not to let anything define you, and especially their past experiences shouldn't define who they are, and it doesn't mean that they should limit themselves within the new environment or fulfilling their future. You know, she says that now she doesn't see herself anywhere else besides New York City because New York City is her home. And Melissa, she said, here in America, there are just so many opportunities. If you work hard, you will succeed. And that's what makes America amazing. So yeah, that was the end of my presentation.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions for Celine?
Any questions?
I have a question.
Nolan.
Nolan. Oh, go ahead,
So,
Nolan.
that was a very you know, enlightening. It was very interesting what you brought to the table, and it reminded me of my friend's mom, Eliseo,
Mm-hmm.
and she's a Polish immigrant, and she came from Poland, and this is very interesting with Stephanie too, because she came just at the fall of like the Berlin Wall. So like she left just prior to it, and she got a visa. She had to get a special visa, and it was like a bunch of loopholes that she had to get through to get to America. And she told me, you know, she became a nurse in Poland. Like she went to nursing school and everything. And then when she came to America, the United States didn't recognize her degree as a nurse, so she had to, like, you know, start from square one basically. But just the story, sorry, this dog. You know, the story, you know, her story was very interesting because it's, you know, it's the same thing that you said, Celine, the whole culture shock, and how and she told me how when she went into the supermarket, she saw, you know, like she went to get cereal, and she saw, like, you know, thousands of brands of cereal, and she was like just shocked at how much cereal there was. And even though it's as simple as cereal, I mean, and it's not a surprise to us, to her it was this, you know, crazy thing. And it was a good story.
Cool. Thanks, Nolan. Professor Napoli did like a little exposition of the structure and the highlights and the importance of your talk. So in the chat, you should check it out. It's pretty
Oh,
cool.
I didn't even notice.
It's pretty awesome.
Oh, yeah.
Do more listening.
Yeah, yes.
We should put you on Facebook to advertise for the oral history course next semester. Just like
probably, yeah. Actually, I presented this at the Municipal Archives in Manhattan with Professor Siegel. So that was like one of the biggest highlights of my career, in a sense. You know, I actually regret, I'm a childhood education major with a concentration in history, and now I regret not majoring in history. Instead, I only had 2 more classes. But I know, Grace, I know Steph. But yeah, but you know, it is what it is. I enjoy history and I enjoyed my time. Maybe I might do social studies, so I'll be able to take all of your classes when I do social studies.
Yeah, awesome. Also, we can excerpt what you just said and put it on Facebook to advertise for our major.
Sure. And I have, I have the Brooklyn College hoodie on. I have, I'm perfect.
I just want to let all the speakers know that Professor Banerjee wrote in the chat, and she said, a truly teach-in experience, fascinating lessons from our students. She has to run to make other presentations, so she's going to miss others, but she just thanks you and congratulates you. So pretty great.
Thank you, Professor.
This was so fantastic, guys. I think for those of you that are going to be here next fall, I think we should do this again because I learned so much and it was so great to hear your individual voices as historians really sort of inflect your research. So that was really, really wonderful. Thank you so, so much for doing this at the end of the semester when I know you have other things that you want to be doing too. So thank you. Big round of applause for our speakers. And students who are in this talk who are not graduating, I'm gonna rope you in the fall, so you gotta watch out. Robin's writing a thesis with me. Sounds like a great teach-in topic. Let's do it. All right, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. Professor Napoli, do you have anything else you want to say, or?
There's nothing. We are going to meet as a historical society after exams are finished. More on that later. Please, good luck on your final exams. If I don't get the opportunity to talk with you again before, if I don't get the opportunity to talk with you again, please stay in touch with us. We're going to miss you, and I mean it. I'm looking forward to seeing Robin again in the fall, and be well, guys.
Yeah.
Stay safe.
Take care, everybody.
And thank you, Lauren, for putting this together.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you to Grace. It was actually Grace's idea. So Grace leaving us a legacy in the history department in more ways than one. All right, guys. Bye.